The first man's hand closed on her jacket, and that was his mistake. Not walking up on her. Not the three of them spreading out across that parking lot like they had all the time in the world. His mistake was the grab. The committed, drunk, sure of itself grab. The hand that reached out fully convinced the thing it was reaching for would not reach back. Because the second his fingers locked into the fabric of her jacket, he gave her his weight. He gave her his wrist. He gave her every ounce of his own forward momentum. And a person trained the way she was trained does not need anything else from you. You hand her your weight, and you have handed her the whole fight. He went over the hood of the car before he understood he was moving. Not thrown, folded. There's a difference, and it matters. And we'll get to why it matters more than anything else in this whole story. His own grab became the handle. She turned it, stepped, dropped her hips, and the big man came up off his heels and over and down onto the warm metal of the nearest car with his arm locked high behind his back in a way that turns a 200-pound drunk into a man who can only think about one single thing in the entire world, which is that arm, which is the pain in that arm, which is staying very, very still so there is less pain in that arm. 3 seconds. That's man number one. The second one was already swinging. He had to be. His friend going down hadn't computed. It had broken the picture so badly that his body just finished what it started, and what it started was a punch. A drunk man's punch in a parking lot. Big and looping and slow, thrown from way back at the shoulder, the kind of punch you could read a newspaper before it landed. She wasn't where it landed. She was never going to be where it landed. She'd already shifted. A small step, a turn of the hips, geometry, and his own swing carried him past her the same way his friend's grab had carried him down, and she helped him along with one open hand on the back of his shoulder, a redirect, nothing more, and he met the side of that same car. Now there were two of them against it. Two men learning the same lesson from two slightly different angles, one folded and locked, one bent over the panel with the wind gone out of him. 6 seconds. The third one hung back. The third one always hangs back. The least committed one in any pack. The one who came along because the other two were going. The one whose courage was mostly other people. And the third one had just watched 2 seconds of physics he could not explain happen to both his friends. And somewhere in the rotted drunk fog of his brain one clean thought floated up to the surface, cold and clear. I should not be here. He didn't get touched. She didn't have to touch him. She just turned, squared up, hands open and ready and not even raised high. Just ready, just looking at him. And the third man did the smart thing, the only smart thing any of the three of them did that whole night. He put his hands up, not the fighting way, the other way, and he backed off into the orange light. 9 seconds, start to finish. 3 men down or backing away. And here is the part one need you to hold on to, because it is the whole story dressed up as a detail. Not one of them had a broken bone. Not one. She could have. Lord, she could have. A person with her training, 2 committed attackers handing her their own weight and momentum on a platter. She could have snapped the first man's elbow when she folded him over that hood. Easier than the lock, honestly. Cleaner. She could have put the second one's face through the window instead of into the door panel. She could have sent all 3 of them home with things that would follow them the rest of their lives. And a court in Wisconsin or anywhere else on this earth would have called every bit of its self-defense and thanked her for her restraint. 3 drunk men cornered a woman alone at her car at night. No jury convicts her of anything. She didn't do any of it. She controlled them. She broke their intention instead of their bones. And the difference between those two things, between hurting a man because you can and stopping a man because you have to, that difference is the entire distance between a thug and a professional. It is the entire distance between the 3 men in that parking lot and the one woman standing over them. And it is, when you boil this whole thing down to the bone, The exact reason I got in my truck years later and drove to a YMCA in Milwaukee to sit across a folding table from her and ask her about a worn-out belt hanging on a wall. But I'm ahead of myself. Let me back up. Not far. Just 40 seconds. Let me back up to before the grab, because the grab is where it ended, not where it started, and the way it started tells you everything. It started inside the bar. A small town in Wisconsin, the edge of it, the kind of town that exists mostly because there's a base near it. Half bars, half nothing. The asphalt holding the day's heat into the night, and the streetlights that ugly sodium orange that makes everybody look a little sick. Late. She'd come out to have one drink and not be alone in her apartment for an hour, which is a thing people do, which is a thing that should cost nobody anything. Jeans. A jacket. Sitting by herself at the end of the bar, having that one drink slow, bothering no one. And 3 men were watching her. I know they were watching because 2 of them said so afterward, to a police officer, in statements I've got right here on the table along with the report. They'd clocked her the way a certain kind of man clocks a woman alone, and they'd done some math about her. This is where the irritation starts to climb in me, friend, and I'll tell you up front it doesn't go back down for the rest of this episode, so settle in. They decided some things. They decided she was alone, which was true. They decided she was small, which, all right, she's not a big woman. And then they decided the third thing. And one of them actually used this word in his own statement. I am not dressing it up. It's right here in the man's own words. They decided she'd be easy. Easy. So when she set down her glass and got up and walked out into that parking lot toward her car, they got up too. 40 seconds behind her. Out into the orange. She heard them. Of course she heard them. She'd heard them stand up before they finished standing. Because hearing a room was a thing that had been drilled into her so deep it ran underneath her own thoughts. Same as the keys she already had threaded between her fingers, a thing she did without thinking, because a long time ago somebody taught her to do it without thinking. She didn't run. People always ask why she didn't run, and the answer is the one nobody likes to hear. You don't run from 3. You can't. The day you turn your back on 3 and run is the day you give 3 men your back, and the slowest thing you do after that is the last thing you do. She'd taught that to 100 Marines. You don't run from 3. You face 3. You make 3 of them wish there were a 4th, so at least one could go for help. So she turned around, keys in her hand, and she gave them the one thing she was ever going to give them, which was a way out. She told me about this part herself, years later, almost the same words that are in her statement, which is how I know she didn't dress it up after the fact. No heat in it. Flat. The way you tell a stranger his headlight was out. She said, "You don't want to do this. Go back inside." That was the warning. One warning. She held the door open for them with 6 words. And any one of the 3 of them, right at that second, could have walked through it. Could have felt the thing the back of a man's neck feels when it's wrong about something. Could have heard the total, bottomless absence of fear in a woman's voice and understood, the way an animal understands, that the absence of fear meant something, meant she knew something they didn't. The door was right there. She was holding it open for them. The one in the middle laughed. And he said the thing. I'll give it to you straight because the whole rotted heart of this story lives inside it. The one in the middle laughed, and he said, "She's just a woman. She's just a woman." I have read that line in that report more times than I can count. And every single time something pulls tight in my chest, and I'm an old man, I've buried friends, I don't pull tight in the chest easy anymore. But that line does it. Every time. Because of what the man did not know. Because of the math he was too drunk and too sure and too poisoned by a whole lifetime of bad ideas to actually do. He did not know that the just a woman standing in front of him in jeans and a zipped-up jacket with her keys in her fingers had spent the better part of a decade as a martial arts instructor for the United States Marine Corps. He did not know she held a black belt in a disciplined built, designed, on purpose, from the ground up, for exactly the situation those three men had just walked themselves into. Outnumbered, no weapon, close quarters, finish it fast. He did not know that "she's just a woman," spoken in that parking lot on that night, was the single most expensive sentence any of the three of them would ever say in their lives. He found out 3 seconds later, when his own hand closed on her jacket. You know the rest. You've already seen it. 9 seconds, and the situation. That's the word the officer used in his report, a cop's word, the highest one professional ever pays another. The situation was secured. Two men controlled against a car, one frozen with his hands up, and the woman who did it standing in the middle of it, not even breathing hard, already reaching into her pocket. Because that's the last thing she did out there, and it's my favorite thing, and it's the thing that told me I had to tell you about her. She didn't gather up her dignity and drive home and never tell a soul, which is what a lot of people would do and what nobody on earth could blame them for. No, she kept one hand on that first man, keeping him folded and still over the hood, and with her free hand she took out her phone and she called the police. Herself. On the whole scene. Herself. 3 assailants. 1 caller. The same person. That's how the report reads it, and it stopped me cold the first time I saw it. She called it in, and then she waited, kept the man controlled, kept her eyes on the one with his hands up, and stood there in that sick orange light waiting for the cruiser, because she was not going to leave a scene. She was not going to let it turn into he said by morning. She was going to do it right, by the book, the way she did everything, the way somebody had taught her to do everything. So, that's the parking lot. That's the part everybody asks me about, and now you've got it, and we're a few minutes in. But here's what I need you to understand. You don't know her yet. You know 9 seconds of her. And 9 seconds of a person is not a person. It's a headline. It's a clip with the wrong caption slapped on it, flying around the internet attached to somebody's bad opinion. I did not drive to Milwaukee for 9 seconds. I drove to Milwaukee for the 27 years that made the 9 seconds possible, for the belt on the wall that her students think is decoration, and for a question that bothered me from the moment I first read that report, a question I want you carrying with you as we go back to the beginning. Why didn't she break them? Hold that. Because the answer isn't in the parking lot. The answer's in a house in Wisconsin, in a family that didn't speak to her for a while, in everything she came from. And where she came from is the strangest part of this whole thing. Because the woman who controlled 3 men in 9 seconds and refused to hurt a single one of them came out of a home where what she did in that parking lot was, to the people who raised her, just about the worst thing a human being could do to another. Her name was Corporal Anneliese Boed. Boed. You say it Boed, like the front half of body, with the back half cut off, and she'll correct you, politely, if you get it wrong. She got it corrected her whole life. She's used to it. German on her father's side, a few generations back, but the family kept the name and kept some of the old ways with it. Wisconsin, all the way down. And the first thing you have to understand about her, the thing that makes everything else click into place, is that she was raised by people who would have been ashamed of the parking lot. Not proud, not relieved, ashamed. People who believed, down to the foundation of who they were, that violence was the failure. Always, every time, no exceptions, and that a person who'd learned to do what their daughter did out there had taken a wrong turn somewhere a long way back. Let me take you to that house. The house was full of books and quiet in that house was not peace. That's the first thing to understand. There are homes where quiet means everything's all right, and there are homes where quiet is a kind of weather, a pressure that sits over the dinner table, and the Boed house was the second kind. Her father taught philosophy at a small college an hour from where they lived. Ethics, mostly. the formal study of right and wrong. And her mother had been a teacher too before the kids came, literature, and the two of them had built a life out of words and ideas and the deep, sincere, lifelong conviction that the worst thing one human being could ever do to another was raise a hand against them. I want to be careful here, friend, because it would be easy to make these people into a joke, and they were not a joke. I sat with one of them. I'll get to that. They were good people. They believed something hard, and they lived it all the way down, which is more than most of us manage with the things we say we believe. Her father had marched in his younger days, against one war and then another. There was a framed photograph in the hallway. Anneliese described it to me, of her father as a young man at a demonstration, holding a sign, his face lit up with a certainty he carried the rest of his life. That photograph hung in the hallway her whole childhood. She walked past it every single day. A picture of her father standing against war. And she was going to grow up and put on the uniform. You can already feel it, can't you? The collision way out at the end of the road. The two of them walking toward each other before she's even old enough to understand there's going to be a collision. She was the middle of three. Older brother, younger sister, and Anneliese in the gap between them. And middle kids, you may know this if you are one or raised one. Middle kids learn to read a room early. They have to. The attention isn't automatically there's the way it is for the oldest and the youngest. So they learn to find it, or learn to do without it, or learn the third thing, which is the thing she learned. They learn to watch. To sit at the edge of the family and take in the whole of it. Who's angry? Who's about to be? What the silence means today. She told me once that she couldn't remember a time she wasn't doing it. Reading the table, reading her parents' shoulders, knowing a fight was coming before the first word of it got said. It wasn't a skill she went looking for. It was just the water she grew up in. Hold that, by the way. Tuck it away somewhere. Because that quiet middle child watching, that reading of the room from the edge of it, that is the exact same thing that had her on her feet and turning around in a parking lot before three drunk men finished standing up from their stools. The thing her family gave her without meaning to is the thing that kept her alive. Houses do that. They build into you the tools you'll use for the life they never wanted you to have. She was not a violent child. I want that on the record, because the easy version of this story is the one where the little girl is secretly a brawler the whole time. And that's not true. That's not who she was. She was a watcher. She was a reader, sat in trees with books, her mother's daughter in that one way at least. She wasn't picking fights, but she was, even small, the kind of kid who could not stand to watch the strong push the weak around. And on a playground, there is always the strong pushing the weak around. And most kids learn to look away from it, because looking away is easier and safer. Anneliese never learned to look away. That's the part of her that was hers, and nobody gave it to her. She'd put herself between things. A bigger kid and a smaller kid. Not fighting. She didn't know how to fight then, just standing in the space between. The way she'd later stand in the space between herself and three men, hands open, blocking the path with her body and her stillness. She got pushed down for it sometimes. Came home with her knees scraped and her chin up. And here's the thing that started the long, quiet war in that house. When she came home like that, scraped up because she'd stepped between a bully and some smaller kid, her parents did not praise her for it. They sat her down and they talked to her, gently, lovingly, with all the patience in the world, about how she could have handled it differently. How standing in the way was still a kind of confrontation. How there were other paths. Get a teacher, talk it out, walk away, and bring an adult. All true, by the way. All reasonable. I'm not telling you they were wrong. I'm telling you what it did to a kid, year after year, to be quietly corrected every time she protected somebody. To learn that the impulse in her, the thing that said you do not let the strong push the weak around, that the very best impulse she had was, in her own home, a problem to be managed, a flaw in her thinking they were patiently trying to fix. She learned to stop telling them. That's what happens. The kid doesn't stop being who she is. She just stops bringing it home. The watching turned inward. She'd handle the playground her own way and come home with a clean story. And there it is, friend, the first brick in a wall that took 20 years to build. A daughter learning to keep the truest part of herself out of her own house. The years went by the way they do. She was a good student, couldn't not be, in that house. But she wasn't her parents' kind of student. They lived in the world of ideas, of abstractions, of what should be. She kept drifting toward what is. She liked things she could do with her hands and her body. She ran. She was good at it, distance running, the lonely kind, the kind where it's just you and the road and your own breath for an hour. And I think, she never said this is me. I think the running was the only place that quiet house had given her where the quiet was actually hers, where it meant what it was supposed to mean. And somewhere in high school, she found the thing. There was a man in town, older, a veteran, though she didn't know that at first, who ran a little martial arts school out of a converted storefront. Not a flashy place. No trophies in the window, no rows of kids in pajamas yelling. A quiet place, mats and a heavy bag and a few serious people. She'd run past it, and one day she stopped running past it and went in. I don't know exactly what pulled her through that door. She told me she couldn't fully explain it herself. But I've got a guess, and my guess is this. A girl who'd spent her whole life standing in the space between the strong and the weak, and getting pushed down for it, and being told at home that the standing between was a flaw. That girl walked past a place where they taught you how to stand between and not get pushed down, where the thing her family treated as a problem was treated, instead, as a discipline, as something with rules and honor and a teacher who took it seriously. I think she walked into that storefront and felt, maybe for the first time in her life, that the deepest part of her was not a flaw, was not a thing to be managed, was something she could build on. She didn't tell her parents. Of course she didn't. By then the not telling was second nature. She had a part-time job. She paid for the lessons herself. She trained after her runs and came home and ate dinner under that hallway photograph of her father holding his sign against war, and she said nothing. For 2 years she said nothing. Lived a whole second life 2 miles from her own kitchen. Now here's where I want to slow us down, because this is the heart of the family, and the family is the heart of her. And I told you I wasn't going to make these people a joke. The teacher at that storefront, the old veteran, he did not teach her to fight. That's important. That is the entire thing. He taught her not to. He was, I came to understand, a man who'd seen real violence somewhere in his own life. The actual thing, not the idea of it, and a man who's seen the real thing does not love it. He taught the way the genuinely dangerous teach, with a horror of ever using it. The first thing, the last thing, the thing under every other thing he taught her, was that all of this, the throws, the locks, the strikes, the whole hard discipline of it, all of it existed to be a door you never walk through. That the goal of every technique was to make the technique unnecessary. That a real master is recognized not by the men he's hurt, but by the fights that didn't happen because he was standing there. You hear it. I know you hear it. Because that is her father's philosophy. That is the exact thing her father taught from a college lectern an hour up the road. That violence is the failure. That the highest good is the conflict that never becomes a conflict. It's the same truth, the very same truth, just spoken in a different language, the language of the mat instead of the language of the seminar room. Her father said it with Kant and her teacher said it with a heavy bag, and they would never in 100 years have recognized each other as allies, and they were saying the same thing. That's the tragedy sitting underneath this whole story, friend, and I want you to feel it before we get to the breaking part. Anneliese Boed did not rebel against her father's values. She found them. She found them in the one place her father could never have looked, and she honored them more completely than maybe anyone else in that family ever did. She just did it through her body instead of her mouth, through what she could do instead of what she could say. And because of where she found it, because of the shape it took, her father would spend years believing she had betrayed everything he stood for. The break came when she was 17, and it came over a recruiter. She'd known for a while by then. The running, the storefront, the whole second life, it had pointed somewhere, and the somewhere was the Marine Corps. Not the Army, not the Navy, the Marines. I asked her why the Marines specifically, and she gave me an answer I've thought about ever since. She said it was the discipline. She said everybody thinks the Marines are about violence, about being the most violent, and that the people who think that have it exactly backwards. She said the most disciplined fighters are the ones who are hardest to provoke, because they've got nothing to prove. She said she wanted to be around people who were dangerous and quiet about it. People who'd done the work so deep they didn't need to show you. She said, and this stopped me, she wanted to be the most controlled person in any room she walked into. Think about that coming out of a 17-year-old. And then think about it coming back around, 10 years later, in a parking lot, 3 men down and not one of them with a broken bone. She told her parents at dinner. She'd worked it out. She was going to enlist after graduation. She'd already talked to a recruiter. She'd already, in her own head, signed. She laid it on the table the way you lay down a thing you've decided and aren't asking permission for. Her mother cried. Her father went quiet. And his quiet, in that quiet house, was the loudest thing in the world. He didn't yell. He never yelled. Yelling was beneath the values. He asked her questions. That was his weapon, the Socratic thing, the gentle, relentless questioning that was how he'd won every argument in that house for as long as she'd been alive. How could she, his daughter, raised the way she'd been raised, choose to become an instrument of the exact thing he'd spent his life standing against? Did she understand what she was agreeing to? Did she understand that the discipline she admired so much was, at the bottom of it, a discipline for killing? He asked it kindly. He asked it as a man genuinely trying to understand how he had failed, because that's how he experienced it. As his failure, his daughter walking toward the one thing he'd built his whole self around opposing. And here is the part that broke my heart when she told it. Sitting at that folding table in Milwaukee, an old woman now telling me about being 17. She said she tried to explain it to him. She tried to tell him what her teacher had taught her, that it was the same thing. Dad, it's the same thing you believe. It's about the fight you don't have. It's about being so capable that you never have to. She tried to put it into his language, to build the bridge. And she couldn't. She was 17. She didn't have the words yet. She'd spend the next 10 years getting the words. And he was a professor of ethics with 40 years of words. So the conversation that might have saved them, the conversation where the two of them figure out they're standing on the same ground, that conversation lost. Because she was a kid trying to explain the deepest thing she knew to the one man on earth most equipped to argue her out of it. He didn't forbid her. He couldn't. She was nearly 18, and any way forbidding wasn't his way. What he did was worse in a way. He told her, quietly, that he loved her and that he could not pretend to support this, that he would not come to the things, the send-off, whatever ceremonies there'd be. He said he hoped she'd understand that a man has to be able to live with himself, and that he could not stand and smile and celebrate his daughter walking into the machine he'd given his life to standing against. And then he got up from the table and went to bed, and the house was quiet, and the quiet was not peace. The hallway photograph stayed up. She walked past it on her way out the door to basic training months later, her father holding his sign. Her mother drove her to the bus, crying the whole way, and her father stayed home. She got on the bus to become a United States Marine, and the man who'd taught her, without ever knowing it, exactly what kind of Marine to be. The man whose values she was about to carry into the Corps more faithfully than she carried anything. That man was sitting in a quiet house under a photograph of his younger self, certain his daughter was lost. She wrote him letters from basic. I've seen a couple. He didn't answer for a long time. That's where she came from, friend. That's the house. So now, when I tell you she could have broken those 3 men in that parking lot and chose not to, now you're starting to understand that the choosing not to wasn't restraint she picked up in the Corps. She brought it in with her. She brought it from a storefront and from a dinner table and from a hallway photograph, from a father and a teacher who'd have hated each other and were the same man. The Marine Corps didn't teach Anneliese Boed not to hurt people. It just, finally, gave her somewhere to be exactly who she already was. Let me take you to boot camp, because that's where the watching girl met the thing she was actually built for, and where a drill instructor said one sentence to her that she carried for the rest of her career and into that parking lot too. Boot camp tried to make her loud, and it couldn't, and that turned out to be the most important thing that ever happened to her in the Corps. Let me explain what I mean. Marine recruit training is built on a kind of controlled chaos in those first weeks. The yelling, the smoke sessions, the deliberate dismantling of whoever you walked in as so they can build the Marine they want out of the pieces. And the system is very good at finding the loud ones and the proud ones and the ones who came in with something to prove and breaking those things off of them. The recruit who pops off. The recruit who flinches. The recruit who needs to be the center of it. Drill instructors find those edges and they file them down because edges get people killed. Anneliese Boed walked in with none of those edges. She walked in as the watcher. The quiet middle child who'd spent 17 years reading rooms from the corner of them, and a recruit who reads the room and gives the system exactly what it's asking for and nothing it isn't. That recruit is a strange thing for a drill instructor to chew on. There was nothing to break off. They'd scream in her face and she'd absorb it. Eyes front, nothing behind the eyes giving them anything to grab. Not defiance. Defiance is a handle. Defiance is loud. Defiance is the loud one in the parking lot saying she's just a woman. Not fear either. Just stillness. The kind of stillness that an experienced drill instructor eventually starts to find interesting, because it's rare, and because the ones who have it tend to be worth watching. There was a senior drill instructor. I won't give her name, because I couldn't confirm it the way I'd want to, and I won't put words in a real person's mouth I can't stand behind. But there was a senior drill instructor who took notice. And about midway through, during one of those moments where the platoon's getting torn apart for something, the SDI stopped in front of Boed, got down in her face the way they do, and Boed gave her nothing. The stillness, eyes front the wall. And the SDI, instead of escalating, did the thing the really good ones do, which is recognize the thing in front of them for what it actually is. She held there a second, and then she said, "Lo," just for Boed. One sentence. Boed carried it the rest of her career. She said it to me at that folding table 30 years of life later, word for word, and her voice changed when she said it, the way a voice changes around the things that actually made you. The senior drill instructor said, "You're not scared. You're just waiting. Good. The Corps needs the ones who wait. The Corps needs the ones who wait. You feel that land, don't you? Because that's the whole woman in 9 words. That's the parking lot. That's the keys threaded between the fingers and the one warning given flat with no heat in it. And the 9 seconds that didn't start until a man's hand closed on her jacket. She wasn't scared. She was waiting. She was always waiting for the room to tell her what it was, for the moment to declare itself, for the other person to make the decision so she could make hers. The SDI saw it in week 6 of boot camp. It took the rest of us, and 3 drunk men, a lot longer. She graduated. Middle of the platoon in the things that get measured loudly, top of it in the things that don't. The discipline scores, the rifle, the stuff that rewards a still hand and a quiet head. And here's a thing I want to put in plainly, because the easy version of this story would skip it. She was not a physical phenom. She was fit. She was a runner. She had the storefront training, but she was not the biggest or the strongest recruit in that company, not by a long way. There were men there who could have picked her up and thrown her across the squad bay. This matters. Hold it. Because everything that made Anneliese Boed dangerous was built on the foundation of her not being the biggest or the strongest, of her having learned, from the very beginning, that strength was never going to be the thing she won with. She was going to win with the other thing, with leverage, with timing, with the still head and the waiting, with using the bigger, stronger person's own weight against them, which is, if you think about it, the entire philosophy of her life, the whole thing. The daughter of a man who believed you never met force with force, learning to fight in the one way that meets force with redirection. Her first assignment out of training put her, like a lot of Marines, somewhere ordinary. I'm going to keep her specific units and dates soft here, the way I do, because this is a dramatized account, and I won't pin a real feeling story onto units that'd let somebody go looking for a real person who isn't quite this person. Call it a support role on a base in the Southeast, the long, humid kind of duty station, the kind of place where the air sits on you in July. And it would have been an unremarkable enlistment. Good Marine, does her job, gets out. You never hear about her, except for one thing. She kept training. On her own time. She found the people on base who took hand-to-hand seriously, and there are always a few, and she trained with them before her shift and after it, and word started to get around, the way it does, that the quiet one in the support shop could do things on the mat that didn't match how she looked. And that's how she got pulled toward the thing she was actually built for. The Marine Corps Martial Arts Program, MCMAP, if you don't know it. It's the Corps' own hand-to-hand combat system, belt ranks like a civilian martial art, tan up through black, and the people who teach it, the instructors, who wear a tab to market, are a specific breed. Because here's the thing about MCMAP that almost nobody outside the Corps understands, and it's the thing that made it the exact right home for Anneliese Boed. MCMAP is not, at its heart, about teaching Marines to hurt people. Marines already have rifles for that. MCMAP exists for the space the rifle doesn't cover, the close space, the crowd, the checkpoint, the moment a situation is bad but not bad enough to shoot, the moment you need to control a human being without killing him. The whole top half of the system, the part the instructors care most about, is judgment, is restraint, is the question of how much force and the discipline to use less than you're capable of. They teach it with a phrase, one mind, any weapon. But the deeper phrase, the one the serious instructors live by, is about the responsibility that comes with capability. The more dangerous you are, the more carefully you must move through the world. A Marine who can kill with his hands carries an obligation to not, until the moment leaves him no choice. You see it. You see where she'd found herself. A girl raised by a philosopher who taught that violence is the failure of thought. Trained by a storefront veteran who taught that the goal of every technique is to never use it. And now, in the Marine Corps of all places, in the one institution her father believed was the machine of violence itself, she had found the one program whose entire reason for existing was the disciplined refusal of unnecessary force. She had found her father's ethics with a tan belt on. She'd found her teacher's horror of violence written into a military curriculum. She tested for instructor and she passed, and she was good, not because she was the most ferocious on the mat, but because she was the best at teaching the part that mattered, the control part. The restraint part. The part where you take a 19-year-old kid who's all muscle and ego and aggression, and you teach him that the highest skill isn't the throw, it's knowing when not to. She could teach a big, strong, angry kid to do less, to stop short, to control instead of break. She'd stand a recruit twice her size in front of her and let him come, and she'd put him down soft, controlled, no harm, every time, and then she'd make him do it the same way to somebody else, put them down without hurting them. She wasn't training fighters. She was training people to be safe to be around even when they're dangerous. Which is the whole thing. Which is, I'd argue, the only thing. Now, I told you at the start I wasn't going to give you the false version where everything goes smooth. And here's where the first real crack shows up, because it's important and because it's where the irritation in me comes back. Not gender, not the way you might expect. Though there was some of that. There's always some of that. Men who didn't love getting put on their backs by a woman half their size. Men who needed to make a comment to put the world back the way they liked it. She handled those the way she handled everything. Stillness, no handle, do the work, let the work speak. That wasn't the crack. The crack was the system not knowing what to do with someone whose entire value was restraint. Here's what I mean, and here's where you start to see the long shape of her career. The Marine Corps, like any big institution, rewards what it can measure and see. It rewards the dramatic. The award citations, the meritorious promotions, the attention, they flow toward the visible act. The Marine who does the loud, brave thing in front of witnesses. And Anneliese Boed's entire excellence was, by its nature, invisible. Her whole gift was making things not happen. The fight that didn't break out because she defused it. The recruit who didn't break a training partner's arm because she taught him control. The situation that stayed calm because she was standing in it being still. You cannot give a man a medal for the fight that didn't happen. There's no citation for the bone that didn't break. The better she got at her actual job, the more invisible the results of her job became, because the results were absences. Absences of harm, absences of escalation, absences of the dramatic thing that gets noticed. She told me about a moment that stuck with her, and it stuck with me. There was an incident on a base, not hers exactly, a story that went around, where a Marine she'd trained, a big kid she'd spent months teaching control to, got jumped off base by a couple of guys. And he did exactly what she'd drilled into him. He controlled them, didn't break anybody, defused it, walked away, nobody seriously hurt. And the kid got, basically, nothing. No notice. Because nothing dramatic had happened. That was the whole point. Nothing dramatic happened. Whereas another kid, around the same time, got into a brawl, broke a guy's jaw, and that became a story people told, a thing people half admired even as he got in trouble for it. The breaking got remembered. The not breaking vanished. And Boed told me she sat with that for a long time. Because she realized the system she'd given her life to could not actually see the thing she was best at, could not value it. The very excellence she'd built, control, restraint, the disciplined refusal, was structurally invisible to the institution that depended on it. And she had a choice in front of her, the choice that every person whose virtue is quiet eventually faces. Get loud, get visible, start doing the kind of work that gets seen and rewarded, or keep doing the invisible work because it's right, and accept that you will not be recognized for the best thing about you. She kept doing the invisible work. Of course she did. She was the one who waits. She was her father's daughter and her teacher's student, and both of those men had taught her, in their different languages, the same hard thing, that the best thing you do is often the thing nobody will ever applaud, because it's the bad thing that didn't happen, and you can't see a bad thing that didn't happen. You can only see the empty space where it would have been. This is the part of her story I most wanted you to have, friend, before we get to the rest. Because I think we live in a time that's gotten very loud about courage, very visible about it, very good at the brawl that breaks a jaw kind of story, the kind that goes around with the wrong caption on it. And here was a woman whose entire life was the other kind. The quiet kind. The kind that shows up as nothing happened, as a fight that wasn't, as a room that stayed calm, as three men in a parking lot who went home with their bones intact and no story to tell because there was nothing dramatic to tell. She spent a whole career being excellent at the one thing the system was built not to notice. And she did it anyway. There's no medal in this story. I want to tell you that now. So you're not waiting for it the way you might be, the way these stories sometimes train you to wait for the citation, the ceremony, the moment the institution finally sees her. It doesn't come. Nobody pinned anything on Anneliese Boed for being the most controlled person in every room she walked into. There was no injustice in it. Exactly. Nobody stole her award. Nobody held her down out of malice. It's quieter and sadder and truer than that. It's just that the thing she was best at doesn't have a medal, has never had a medal, will never have a medal, because you cannot decorate an absence. And she made her peace with that early, in a humid base in the southeast, thinking about a kid who controlled two attackers and got nothing for it, and chose to keep teaching control anyway. She did her years. She made corporal. She trained more Marines than she could count to do the hardest thing, which is less. And eventually her enlistment came to its end, and she had a decision to make about staying or going. And there's a part of that decision that connects all the way back to a quiet house in Wisconsin and a father who still wasn't really speaking to her, because something had happened in those years, slowly, in the letters that I need to tell you about. But first I have to take you to the only other place this story gets loud. Because there was one time, exactly one, in all her years, that Anneliese Boed used what she knew on another human being before that parking lot. And it wasn't in combat. It was on a base, and it was to protect somebody. And it's the reason she understood, long before three drunk men found out, exactly what she was capable of and exactly why she'd spend her whole life not using it. It was a barracks, late, and a man was hurting a woman, and Anneliese Boed heard it through a wall. That's how it starts the one time. I want to keep this clean, and I want to keep it true to who she was. So I'm going to tell it plainly, and I'm not going to dress it up or drag it out, because she wouldn't have wanted it dragged out, and because the cheap version of this, the version that lingers on the bad part, is exactly the kind of thing she spent her life refusing to be. So, a barracks, late, thin walls, and on the other side of one of them, a man she knew of, another Marine, bigger, a known quantity, the kind of guy other people stepped around, was doing the thing that happens behind thin walls more than any of us wants to know. A junior Marine, a woman, smaller, newer, with no leverage in any sense of the word. And it was getting worse, not better. You could hear it getting worse. People heard it. That's the part that sat in Boed's chest for years afterward, that she wasn't the only one who heard it. Other doors stayed shut. And I'm not here to judge the people behind those doors too hard, because fear is real and a man like that is genuinely dangerous, and the chain of command is a complicated thing to cross at midnight. And most of us, if we're honest, have a door we've kept shut while something was going wrong on the other side of a wall. Most of us are the people who stay in the room. That's not cowardice exactly. It's just the ordinary human arithmetic of how much trouble do I want. Anneliese Boed had never been able to do that arithmetic. We talked about this. The watcher who couldn't look away on the playground. The kid who put herself between the bully and the smaller kid and got pushed down for it, and came home with her chin up. That kid was still in there, fully intact, 30 pounds of muscle and a black belt later. She could not let the strong push the weak around. It was the deepest thing in her, deeper than training, the thing nobody gave her and nobody could take. And so while other doors stayed shut, Anneliese Boed's door opened, and she crossed the hall, and she went in. Now here is where you find out who she really was, because here is where everything she'd built collided with everything she believed. She did not hurt him. She could have. This is a man, friend, who by any moral reckoning had it coming. A bigger Marine hurting a smaller one. The exact configuration of the world she'd hated since she was 7 years old. And she had in her hands the trained ability to put him on the floor in a way he'd remember for the rest of his life. She had every justification a person could ever want. Nobody, not a court, not a chain of command, not God himself, would have blamed her for breaking that man. And the thing in her that had wanted, her whole life, to make the strong stop, that thing was screaming for it. She didn't. She controlled him. Same as the parking lot. Years before the parking lot. She got between, she got a hold. She took him off his balance and off the woman and down and still, locked up, helpless, and she held him there. Not hurting him, just stopping him, just making him, for the first time in his life maybe, completely unable to do the thing he wanted to do. And she got the woman out of that room, and she held him until other people finally came. Because now that a door had opened, now that somebody had moved, the other doors opened too. That's how it works. Somebody has to go first, and then everybody can. And she handed it over to the system, by the book, the way she did everything. And she told me that the thing she remembered most, the thing that taught her who she was not the fight. The fight was nothing. The fight was 3 seconds. What she remembered was the moment she had him locked up and helpless and at her complete mercy, and the whole weight of her whole life was leaning on her to hurt him, to make him pay, to use the power she'd spent a decade building for exactly this, the bad man under her hands, and she didn't. She chose, in that moment, with everything in her screaming the other way, to use less force than she was capable of, to control instead of break. And she said that was the moment she understood what her teacher had been trying to tell her in that storefront all those years ago, and what her father had been trying to tell her at the dinner table, the same thing in 2 languages, that the discipline was never about whether you could. It was always, only, about whether you would. That anybody can hurt a person who deserves it. The whole entire point, the thing that separates a protector from just a stronger predator, is being able to hurt the person who deserves it and choosing not to. That's the night she found out she was the kind of person who chooses not to. And once you know that about yourself, once you've been tested at the very bottom of it and held, you carry that. It goes quiet, it goes down underneath, and it waits. And years later, it's waiting in a parking lot when a man's hand closes on a jacket. And it's the reason 3 drunk men go home with their bones. The barracks thing didn't get her a medal either. Of course it didn't. It got the bad man processed out, eventually, which was right. It got the junior Marine some safety, which was the point. And it got Boed a quiet, complicated reputation. The woman who'd go in, who you didn't want to be on the wrong side of, but who also, people noticed, never left a mark on anybody she didn't have to. The control was the legend, more than the strength. Among the people who knew, that's what they said about her. She could end you, and she won't, and that's somehow more frightening than if she would. Let me bring her father back now, because something had been happening, slowly, across all these years, in the mail. She kept writing him. From boot camp, where he didn't answer. From her first duty station, where he answered after a long time, a short stiff letter, mostly news, nothing in it. And then, slowly, the letters from Wisconsin got a little longer. Here's what I came to understand happened, and I understood it partly from her and partly from sitting with her mother. I'll get there, but here's the shape of it. Her father, the professor of ethics, had built his whole life and his whole self on a clear, bright line. That violence is the failure, full stop. And he'd watched his daughter cross that line, as he saw it, and it had grieved him like a death. But he was, whatever else, an honest thinker. That was the real thing in him, under the certainty. He'd spent 40 years teaching young people to follow an argument wherever it actually goes. even when it goes somewhere they don't want to be. And the letters started giving him an argument he couldn't dismiss. Because his daughter wasn't writing him war stories. She was writing him about teaching restraint, about taking angry boys and teaching them to use less force, about the whole top of the MCMAP house being judgment and control, about the night. She did eventually tell him about the barracks night, in a letter years on, about holding a man helpless and choosing not to hurt him. And her father, reading these letters in a quiet house under a photograph of his younger self holding a sign against war, slowly, against his will, began to recognize something. She told me he wrote her a letter once. She still had it. I didn't see it, but she described it to me, and her voice did the thing again, where he said that he had spent her whole childhood teaching her that the highest good was the conflict that never becomes a conflict, and that he had believed, all this time, that she'd walked away from that, and that he was beginning to understand, from her letters, that she hadn't walked away from it at all, that she'd become, in his words, the most literal practitioner of it he'd ever encountered, that where he had only ever been able to talk about restraint, from a lectern to students, in theory, his daughter had gone and learned to do it, with her hands, on actual dangerous men, in actual rooms where it actually counted. He wrote that he wasn't sure which of them had been the real pacifist. He wrote that maybe a man who refuses to learn to fight has not chosen peace. He's only chosen to be the kind of person to whom peace is the only option available. But a woman who learns every way there is to hurt a person and stands in a room with that knowledge in her hands, and a man who deserves it under them and chooses peace anyway, that woman, he wrote, has chosen something he never had the courage to. That's the reconciliation, friend. It didn't come with a tearful airport reunion. It came in the mail, slowly, over years, two stubborn people who loved each other finding out across 1,000 miles that they'd been standing on the same ground the whole time, just facing opposite directions. By the time her enlistment was winding down, they were writing each other real letters. Long ones. He'd send her things he'd read. She'd send him things she'd learned on the mat that turned out to be ethics in disguise. The hallway photograph stayed up, but it meant something different now, to both of them. And that's a piece of why she made the choice she made about staying or leaving the Corps. Because she could have stayed, could have made a career of it, 20 years, retired as senior instructor. She was good enough, more than good enough. But she'd done the math on the thing we talked about, the invisibility, the metal that doesn't exist for the absence of harm, and she'd made her peace with it, and she'd also started to feel something else pulling. She wanted to teach the control part to people who weren't Marines, to kids, to women walking to their cars at night, to anybody, because the Corps could only ever hand the discipline to the people the Corps already had. And there was a whole world out there of smaller people who needed to know they didn't have to be the biggest to be safe, who needed somebody to teach them what she'd learned. That strength was never the thing you won with. So she got out. Honorable, clean, a corporal with a tan through black story almost nobody outside her old units knew. She went home to Wisconsin for a while. And yes, her father was there, and her mother, and the photograph. And it was awkward and warm and real in the way that only happens with people you've nearly lost and found again. And then she did the most Anneliese Boed thing imaginable with the rest of her life, the thing that tells you everything. She didn't go open a flashy dojo with her name on the window and her belt in a case. She went and taught self-defense at a YMCA in Milwaukee to regular people for almost nothing. The most controlled person in any room she walked into, spending the back half of her life in a rec center teaching nurses and grandmothers and teenage girls how to not get hurt. And this was the part she cared about, how to not hurt anybody more than they had to. Control, even at the bottom, even for them, even for somebody who'd only ever need it once. That's the woman. Now let me take you back to the parking lot. because you've already seen it. You saw it from the outside, the 9 seconds, the throw and the redirect, and the man with his hands up. But you didn't see it from the inside. And now, finally, you can. Now you know what was actually in her head. Because here's what was in her head when she heard those 3 men stand up in the bar behind her. The SDI, 30 years gone, saying you're just waiting. Here's what was in her head as she walked to the car with the keys in her fingers. The watcher, reading the room, the deepest, oldest part of her, doing the thing it had done since she was 7, knowing before she knew. Here's what was in her head when she turned around and gave them the one warning, flat, no heat, go back inside. Her teacher in a storefront. The goal of every technique is to make the technique unnecessary. Hold the door open. Give them the out. The best fight is the one that doesn't happen. She wasn't being polite. She was, in those 6 words, offering them the thing she'd built her whole life around, the chance for the violence to not occur. She was being more merciful in that one sentence than they had any idea. And here's what was in her head when the middle one laughed and said she's just a woman and reached for her jacket. And this is the thing, friend. This is the whole thing. What was in her head was the barracks. The man locked helpless under her hands, and her whole life screaming to hurt him and the choice not to. Because the instant that drunk man's fingers closed on her jacket, Anneliese Boed knew, with the total clarity of 30 years, 2 things at once. She knew she could break him, and she knew she wouldn't. Both, in the same instant, the way you know your own name. The could and the won't, arriving together, the way they'd arrived in that barracks room, the way her father said it in the letter. The discipline was never about whether you can, it's about whether you will. So when she folded him over that hood, she chose, in the fold, exactly how far. Her hands knew to the millimeter where the break was, and her hands stopped short of it, on purpose, in the middle of a fight, against a man who'd have done God knows what to her. She gave him control instead of damage, the way she'd given 100 angry recruits, the way she'd given the barracks man, the way she'd give the second one against the same car a half-second later. The whole 9 seconds, the entire thing everybody asks me about, was not a fight. It was a demonstration. It was Anneliese Boed showing 3 strangers, in 9 seconds, the exact thing she'd spent her whole life on. The difference between what she could do and what she would. And the not breaking, the thing that looks like mercy or looks like restraint or looks like nothing at all. That wasn't her holding back. That was her, fully expressed. That was the most complete version of her there has ever been. 3 men, and not one broken bone, was not Anneliese Boed pulling her punches. It was Anneliese Boed landing them. And when it was over, and she had 1 man folded and still, and 1 bent over the panel, and 1 backing off with his hands up, she did the last thing, the call, on herself, by the book. And you know now where the by the book comes from. It comes from a barracks where she handed it over to the system, comes from a dinner table where she laid her whole future down honestly and took the consequences, comes from a father who taught her that how you do a thing is the thing. She stood in that orange light and called it in and waited for the cruiser. Waiting. Always the one who waits. There's one more piece. There's the question I drove to Milwaukee carrying. And there's the answer she gave me at that folding table. And there's the belt on the wall that her students think is decoration. And there's her mother, and a thing her mother said to me that I haven't been able to put down since. Let me bring it home. The YMCA in Milwaukee has a folding table in a back room near the gym, and that's where I finally sat across from Anneliese Boed, an old woman now, and asked her my question. I'd driven up with it in my chest the whole way. I'd read the report a dozen times, the 9 seconds, the secured scene, the call she made on herself, and the one thing that kept pulling at me, the thing I could not let go of, was the absence in it. The bones that didn't break. Because I've read a lot of police reports, friend, in a lot of years, and I know what's usual and what isn't. And what isn't usual is three drunk men attacking a woman at her car and all three of them walking away whole. The usual thing, the human thing, the thing nobody would blame her for, is that at least one of them goes to a hospital. That's not cruelty. That's just what fear and adrenaline and a real fight do to people, even trained people, especially when the person had every right. So I sat down across the folding table from her, and there was a belt on the wall behind her. Faded, frayed at the edges, the black gone gray in places the way old cloth goes. Hanging on a little hook between a fire extinguisher and a bulletin board with a swim schedule on it. And I'd been told, by the young woman at the front desk who'd set up the meeting, who clearly had no idea who she was sending me back to talk to. I'd been told that the students think it's decoration. A bit of old-timey atmosphere. Something the rec center put up to make the self-defense room look like a real dojo. They don't know it's a United States Marine Corps martial arts program black belt. They don't know the woman who teaches them to get away from a wrist grab earned it the hard way over years they can't imagine. She never told them. It just hangs there, frayed, between the fire extinguisher and the swim schedule, and the kids think it's decoration. That about broke me, honestly, before we even started. But I came with a question, so I asked it. I said, you could have broken them. Any one of them, easy. Nobody on this earth would have said a word against you. Three men, drunk, attacking you at night. You'd have been within your rights to send all three to the hospital, and the law would have thanked you. Why didn't you? And Anneliese Boed looked at me across that folding table for a while. She had the stillness even then, even old. I could see what the SDI saw all those years ago, the wall that gives you nothing to grab, the one who waits. And then she said something I've turned over every day since, and I'm going to give it to you exactly, because it's the whole story. It's the 27 years. It's the answer. She said, because they weren't the test. I didn't understand. I told her I didn't understand. And she said, and I'm going to do my best here. I won't get every word, but I'll get the shape of it. And the shape is what matters. She said that everybody asks her about the three men, about the fight, about whether she was scared, about how she did it, about the throw, about the 9 seconds. And she said the three men were never the hard part. The three men were nothing. The three men were a wrist grab and a drunk punch and some leverage, the easiest thing in the world. She'd done it 10,000 times on the mat against people far more dangerous than three drunks in a parking lot. The three men, she said, were not the test of who she was. The test, she said, came after. The test came in the half-second after she'd folded the first man over the hood and had him locked and helpless and at her complete mercy, with his friend already coming and a third one out there in the dark, and every instinct in her body, every drop of fear and adrenaline and old buried rage, every bit of the 7-year-old who couldn't stand to watch the strong push the weak around, all of it, in that half-second, screaming the same one word. Hurt him. He earned it. He grabbed you. He called you easy. Make him pay. Make all three of them pay. Make them remember. Make sure no woman ever has to be afraid in this parking lot again. And she had the power right there in her hands to do it, the trained, practiced, certain power to do it, and the law would call it justice, and a part of her own heart would call it justice too. And she said, that half-second was the test. Not the men. The half-second. The could and the won't, arriving together, the way they'd arrived in a barracks room decades before, the way her father had finally named it in a letter. The discipline was never about whether you can, it's about whether you will. She said the whole 27 years, the storefront and the boot camp and the SDI and the 1,000 recruits and the barracks night and all of it, the whole life, came down to that 1/2 second over the hood of a stranger's car in an ugly orange parking lot, where nobody was watching, where there'd be no medal either way, where she could have broken him and called it self-defense and slept fine, and she chose, in that half second, with everything screaming, to use less force than she was capable of, to control instead of break, to stop short, on purpose, of the thing she had every right to do. That's the only thing I'm proud of, she told me. Not the throw. Anybody can throw a drunk. I'm proud of the half second. I'm proud that after 27 years, when nobody was watching and I had every reason and every right, I was still the kind of person who chooses not to. And then she said the thing that I think is the truest thing anybody's ever said to me at one of these tables in all my years of sitting at them. She said, "The bones I didn't break aren't a thing I held back. They're the only thing I actually did. The only thing I actually did. Sit with that, friend." 3 men attacked her and she beat all 3 in 9 seconds, and the thing she did, the real thing, the thing that was actually hers, the thing 27 years built, wasn't any of the 9 seconds. It was the not breaking inside the 9 seconds. It was the absence, the empty space where the broken bone would have been and wasn't, because she put it there on purpose. The thing the system could never give her a medal for, because you can't decorate an absence. That absence was her masterpiece. That absence was the whole point of the whole life. She spent 27 years becoming a person capable of terrible things so that she could stand in a parking lot and not do them. The capability was never the achievement. The capability was just the price of admission to the only achievement that mattered, which was the refusal. I told you at the start there's no medal in this story. There isn't. Nobody pinned anything on Anneliese Boed for the parking lot. The report got filed. The 3 men got charged with what drunk men get charged with, and the case did whatever cases do. And the woman at the center of it went back to teaching nurses and grandmothers and teenage girls at a YMCA for almost nothing, under a frayed black belt that everybody thinks is decoration. There's no ceremony at the end of this. There's no institution finally seeing her. I'm not going to lie to you and put one there, because it would be a lie, and because she wouldn't have wanted it, and because, and this is the thing I most need you to hear, because the absence of the medal is not the injustice of this story. It's the meaning of it. Because a medal is the system's way of seeing. And the whole truth about Anneliese Boed is that the best thing she ever did was, by its nature, invisible to any system. It was a bad thing that didn't happen, a bone that didn't break, a man who went home whole, a fight that, in the only way that counted, didn't actually occur because the person at the center of it had spent her whole life learning to make violence unnecessary even in the middle of violence. You cannot see that. You can only see the empty space where the harm would have been. And the people who can read that empty space, who can look at 3 uninjured men and understand that they're looking at the single most disciplined act they'll ever encounter. Those people are rare, and they don't hand out medals. They just drive a long way to sit at a folding table and say thank you, which is what I did at the end before I left. I said thank you. She didn't quite know what for. I think I did, though. I think I was thanking her for the half second. Now I told you there was her mother. Let me close with her mother, because her mother gave me the last piece, the piece that put the whole thing to rest in me. I went to Wisconsin after Milwaukee. Her father had passed by then, a few years gone, peacefully, an old professor of ethics who'd made his peace with his daughter in the mail, and then in person, and then for real, the photograph still in the hallway when he died. But her mother was still there, in the quiet house, older than old, sharp as anything. And I sat with her, and I told her I'd met her daughter, and I told her about the parking lot, because she knew the bones of it, but not the way her daughter had explained it to me. The half second, the only thing I actually did. And her mother was quiet for a while, in that house where quiet had once been weather, and then she told me about the photograph in the hallway. Her husband, young, holding his sign against war. She said her husband had spent his whole life believing that picture was the bravest thing he ever did, standing against violence, refusing it. And she said that near the end, after he and Anneliese had found their way back to each other after the letters, he'd taken her, his wife, to stand in front of that photograph one evening, and he'd said something she'd never forgotten. She said her husband stood in front of that picture of his own young self holding a sign against war, and he said, "I refused violence because I never learned how to do it." That's not courage. That's just a man choosing the only thing he was ever able to choose. And then he said, "Our daughter learned every way there is." And then she stood in a room, more than one room, with a man under her hands who deserved it. And she chose peace anyway, with the power to choose otherwise sitting right there in her hands. And he said, "She's the pacifist. I was just a man who never had the option." And her mother looked at me across that kitchen table, in that quiet house, and she said the thing I drove 300 miles home turning over and over, the thing I'll leave you with, because there's nothing I can say after it that wouldn't just be me getting in the way. She said, "We were so afraid she'd unlearn everything we taught her." And she went off and became the only one of us who actually lived it. That's the story, friend. That's the 27 years inside the 9 seconds. A girl who couldn't watch the strong push the weak around. A father who taught her violence was the failure and didn't recognize her when she became the truest thing he'd ever said. A teacher in a storefront who taught her the goal of every technique is to never use it. A drill instructor who saw in 6 weeks that she was one of the ones who wait. A barracks room and a half-second and a choice. A whole career being excellent at the one thing nobody can give you a medal for. A black belt on a YMCA wall that everybody thinks is decoration. And 9 seconds in an ugly orange parking lot where 3 men found out, too late, that the woman they decided would be easy had spent her entire life becoming capable of breaking them, for the single purpose of being able, when the moment finally came, to choose not to. "She's just a woman," the man said. He had no idea. He had no idea that he was looking at the most controlled person in any room she ever walked into. He had no idea that the mercy he didn't even know he'd been shown was the finished work of 27 years. He went home whole and never understood that the wholeness was a gift deliberately given by a person who could have taken it and chose, in a half-second nobody saw, to give it instead. The bones she didn't break weren't the things she held back. They were the only things she ever really did. Thank you for sitting with me. Thank you for holding that number, 9 seconds, all the way to the end, so I could show you the 27 years folded up inside it. Go easy on the people in your life who are quiet about what they're capable of. The loudest person in the room is almost never the most dangerous one. And the most dangerous one, the truly dangerous one, the one who's done the work all the way down, you'll know her by the bones she didn't break. By the empty space where the harm would have been, by the thing that doesn't show up in any report and doesn't hang on any wall, except maybe, if you're lucky, as a frayed old belt somebody mistook for decoration. I'll see you next time.